Hey, what's going on? This is Sports Truth. I'm your host, Jordan Harris. Today's video, we're going to be doing a $50 giveaway to the best comment. So I'll be reading through the comment sections over the next couple of days. Sorry, not couple of weeks. Next couple of days to see what the best comment is. But to be able to win, you also have to like the video and be subscribed to the channel. Okay? And when I say best comment, that just means it's the funniest, or it's the most informative, or it's just super well thought out, right? So I'm going to choose the best comment, and then I'll reach out to you, letting you know that you won. I'll get your Cash App information, and I'll send you that $50 for that. Okay, so let's get into the video. Today, we're going to be talking about another Florida State thing. So there's people who are still complaining about Florida State not making the playoffs, which, I mean, you have to understand, like, the reasoning behind people being upset and frustrated. They have an obvious reason to be upset. But I also think that other schools in this playoff situation have plenty of reasons to be upset, and nobody's really talking about that. College football, people want things to be fair. Like, that's all it is. Oh, it needs to be fair. It needs to be fair. It's not realistic for everything to be fair and for everything to go your way. It's just not realistic. Sometimes there's two bad decisions. You just got to choose one bad decision and roll with it. It's just the way that the world works. But today I want to talk about how, like I said, there's a valid complaint for each school that was at least close to making the playoffs or did make the playoffs. So let's go through that list right now, and we'll talk about each of these schools and why they actually had a valid reason to complain, even though they haven't been complaining, except Florida State. Okay? So let's talk about Michigan. Michigan went undefeated for the entire year. They have looked outstanding for the entire year. They get to the conference championship, so the Big 10 championship, and they beat the brakes off of Iowa. They pitch a shutout in the conference championship game. That's impressive. So then you would expect the reward when you go undefeated and then you play in your conference championship and then you hold them to 0 points. The expectation is to be given a lollipop game, like a game where you are just about guaranteed to win, right? And I know that's hard to find when you only have 4 of the top teams. Like, it's hard to find a cupcake out of the 4 top teams. But you expect to play the worst of the 4. And what do they get handed? They get handed Alabama. And if you ask me, Alabama's not nearly the worst out of these teams. Like, I actually think they're the second best team right behind Michigan. And they're having to play against them in the first game of the playoffs. So if you think I'm crazy, then maybe you haven't heard, like, whenever Michigan was doing that watch party and they had the whole crowd, they had their whole team there, and they announced who Michigan's going to play. And it was obvious that they were hoping to hear Florida State come across that sound, like, hey, Michigan's playing Florida State. Because once they actually announced that Michigan was playing Alabama, the only sound you can hear was like a groan that came across the crowd, like this, oh. Like, how the heck did we draw Alabama? That's not what they wanted. So, Michigan fans, do they feel like that's fair? I'm sure they don't. So they got plenty of things to complain about with that. Now let's talk about Washington. So what do they have to complain about? What do they honestly have to gripe about right now? I would say the fact that they had to beat Oregon in the middle of the season, a really good Oregon team, one of the best Oregon teams I think I've ever seen, actually. They had to beat a really good Oregon team in the middle of the season. Then after that, they go to the conference championship, and they've got to beat this even better, even more physical Oregon team again to be able to get to the playoffs. If you've played sports before, you know how tough it is to beat a team twice in the same year. Typically, when you lose the first game, you have the advantage the second game. Because when you win, you don't really make a lot of adjustments because you've already won the game. But when you lose, you go back to the drawing board and you say, they only beat us because we messed up on this and we didn't put this linebacker in this position and we maybe shifted the defensive line too often to the left. Like, you have all these different adjustments you can make when you lose. So for Washington to be able to beat a team as good as Oregon twice, they had to do it twice to get into the playoffs. That's something that Washington could be complaining about. But I haven't heard any complaining because they did it. All right. So let's talk about Texas. What do they have to complain about? Texas beat Alabama in the regular season, which y'all know that is hard to do. I don't care which Alabama team you're talking about from now all the way back 15 years from now, 15 years ago. Beating Alabama in any year is hard to do simply because they got talent everywhere, not just on the main level, but they got depth as well behind those starters. So to be able to beat Alabama was a tough thing to do. They beat them, I think it was like the second game of the year, maybe something like that. But what do they get for beating Alabama and then going through and winning the Big 12? Like they creamed the team they played in the Big 12 championship too. They won. They were setting records, throwing the ball over the place. Like they looked exceptionally good. And what does Texas get as a reward for that? They get Alabama sitting across the bracket, staring at them like a rabid dog, begging for an opportunity to avenge that loss. So to go through this first, you beat Alabama. Like, that's crazy enough. Then you get through the season. You win the Big 12 championship. You get into the playoffs. And you go, dang, for us to win, we're going to have to beat them again? I mean, obviously, Alabama's got to beat Michigan first. But that's tough, man. That's something to complain about for sure. Because I'd be like, we got lucky beating them the first time. I don't call it lucky, but like we beat them the first time. It's crazy to have to beat them twice in a season. It's crazy. And not only are they going to have to beat them twice if Alabama beats Michigan, there's a big if there, but not only would they have to beat Alabama twice, but they don't get to play the same Alabama team that they beat earlier this year, because that Alabama team, that quarterback Milroe looked like he should have been relegated to the third, because he obviously did get benched right after that game. But he seemed like he just did not belong to be a Division I quarterback. He looked like he didn't know which read to look at first. He was a one-read quarterback. He would look, head would go down, he would take off running every time, which is part of the reason why he got benched. And now he looks like a college version of Michael Vick. I don't know if it's coaching. I don't know if it's more film study. I don't know who gets the credit at Alabama for that. But his turnaround has been crazy, and it makes this Alabama team way better than they were when Texas played them the first time. So could Texas complain about that? 100% yes. Let's talk about Alabama and their reasons to complain. The only way for Alabama to have gotten into the playoffs is for them to have run the table after they lost to Texas, and then they would have to beat a team that had won 29 straight games and a team that won the last two championships, and a team that has also been at the top of the recruiting every single year for these last few years. That's the only way that Alabama could have done it. Is that something to complain about? Sure, people could complain about that, but they're not, because they did it, right? So let's talk about Georgia. Why could Georgia complain right now? What reasons could Georgia throw out there to complain about? Well, they won 29 straight games. They were number one throughout the entire season. They were right there on the cusp. Like, they were ranked number one in the college football playoffs just the week before they lost in their conference championship game. They have one loss on the season, which was in the conference championship, and they're out. So they went from number one all the way back to 6. And you would expect if a team that's ranked number one, if they lose to an unranked team, yeah, they would go down to number 10, number 11, 12, maybe number 15, something like that, big jumps. But when you lose to an Alabama team that's as good as Alabama, you expect them to drop maybe 1 or 2 spots. You don't expect them to drop 5 spots like they did. So is that something to complain about? Absolutely. Also, Georgia has 1 loss, Texas has 1 loss, Alabama has 1 loss. So there's 3 teams with 1 loss. Georgia is the one team that didn't make it. Obviously, they don't have a conference championship. I get that, obviously. But that's kind of tough. Like, if you look at these 3 teams, they all 3 have 1 loss, and then these 2 make it. The one that doesn't make it, I think they have a legitimate reason to gripe about it, especially when the committee says they're going to take the 4 best teams. I look at Georgia and I'm like, man, could Georgia beat Michigan? Heck yeah, they could. Could they beat Alabama? Obviously, they could because they played in a really close game. Could they beat Washington? I think they would beat Washington pretty good. And could they beat Texas? Yes, I believe they could. Would Georgia beat Florida State? We're actually going to get to see that in the bowl game, but I believe both teams at full strength, Georgia beats them by 3 scores, 17 points or more. So, does Georgia have a reason to complain? Yeah, I think they do. Now let's talk about Ohio State. Ohio State was number 2 and undefeated before they played Michigan. They lost to Michigan, obviously, and then they didn't even get a chance to play in a conference championship game to jump over to potentially win that and then jump over some people to be able to get into the playoffs. And that's what a lot of these schools were banking on. Like Alabama, they had a chance to get into the conference championship game, play really well, and then jump over somebody into the playoffs. Texas had the opportunity to play in the Big 12 championship, play really well, win the game, and then jump over somebody into the conference or into the playoff system. Ohio State, the way that the the way that the Big 10 is set up, when they lost that game to Michigan, they didn't get an opportunity to play into the Big 10 championship. So their season was pretty much done. They just had to sit there and hope that a bunch of teams lost in such a weird way that it allowed them and only them to be considered. So, do they have a reason to complain? Yeah, I think they do too. So, once again, man, so that's all the teams that I want to go over. But I do feel like while everybody is complaining for Florida State, I think everybody has an opportunity to complain. So with that being the case, I think everybody needs to just relax a little bit and hush it down some, because Georgia could be out here talking about boycotting and all that stuff too. Michigan could be on here complaining, crying about boycotting because they draw Alabama. Like, all of these teams have a reason to complain. So as far as I'm concerned, all of that stuff needs to just relax and chill. Just chill out a little bit. I do want to say again, we are giving $50 to the best comment. You do have to be subscribed to the channel. You do have to like the video. And as I always say to close my videos, you could be anywhere in the world, but you're here with me, and I really appreciate that. So God bless. Take care. Peace.